Kings from the Climate Change Media Hub at the Asian College of Journalism, an initiative that is supported by the Interlink Academy, Germany. I am Shailendra Yashwant, mentor at the Climate Change Media Hub, and your host and moderator today for this session. There's been a lot of focus on mitigation last few years, which is about reducing emissions. Because as we've increasingly seen, adaptation is inevitable for our survival. Adaptation, for those of you who are just joining in, is about reducing vulnerability. The central question for adaptation journalism is simple. Are people actually becoming more resilient? And if not, why not? I'm absolutely delighted that we have Smruti Kopikar and Karthik Madhavapeddi, both of them are online, who will share their insights and perspectives on reporting climate adaptation in India. Smruti, for those of you who don't know, is an award-winning Mumbai-based journalist, currently the founder editor of Question of Cities, my former colleague, I'm very proud of that, and friend, who brings over almost 35 years of experience in reporting and writing on range of subjects from climate and development issues to crime, gender, and malnutrition. She has led newsrooms and reporting teams for national newspapers and magazines, including the Indian Express, Outlook, Star News, Hindustan Times. And for people like me, her column, Mumbai Nama, in Free Press Journal, is actually one of the better, it gives a deep insights into what's really happening in that city. I am, for those who don't know, I'm also from Mumbai. So, there's this Mumbai is for us a reference point of what will happen to the future of cities in this country. I'm also delighted to have my friend Karthik today. Karthik is the managing editor of India Spend, and over the last decade, he has led journalism projects on air pollution, crime, public health, and fact checking that have won number of national and international awards, including the Data Journalism Award in 2019 given by the Global Editors Network. Karthik is based in Hyderabad, another city under siege, if you like. And Karthik will be also talking to us about how to use data journalism in reporting adaptation. We've used data journalism in reporting mitigation, but Karthik will be talking to us about how do we report it. Our conversation will run for an hour or so and followed by 15 minutes of question and answer sessions. I will request all of you to keep yourselves muted. Feel free to use the chat box to chuck in comments, questions, queries, any clarifications you might have, and we will come back to address them at the end of the session. So, Karthik, thank you so much for joining us today. I was particularly keen on having you today, because India Spend has built its identity on data-driven public interest journalism. That's your identity, and we've seen your stories. We've referred to your stories. I know government officials also look at India Spend because the data-driven, for once, that excuse that there is no data doesn't exist anymore. So my question to you, Karthik, is why does adaptation reporting, we know mitigation required numbers and required data. Where and why does adaptation reporting specifically need data more than most climate stories? And I would love it if you could illustrate with some examples. I know you have a presentation, and within that, if you could also address how reliable is India's own data, specifically in agriculture. You know, when we speak of crop damage assessment, drought declaration, there is a lot of skepticism about our own data. But at the same time, without that data, it is very difficult to design adaptation initiatives. So over to you, Karthik. Go ahead, address these questions. We've had some discussions. I know you have a lot to share. So I'll just hand over to you for now, Karthik. You can share your screen, by the way. Yeah.
Thanks, Shay, and thank you to the ACJ Climate Media Hub for inviting me to this session. Um, when you first asked me what data there is around adaptation and how we can use it for journalism, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's not a lot of data, which is why it needs much more efforts than mitigation reporting, like we've spoken about. So I don't think I have to define adaptation for this room, but broadly, I'm looking at a few examples to kind of answer your question, Shai, where we're looking at protecting people's lives, people's incomes, and people's you know standard of living, the way of living. So I have three examples today that we'll speak about, and I hopefully they will answer most of the questions that you've raised. So what are we looking at in adaptation reporting, especially when you want to look at data, right? So we want to see whether the initiatives that have been taken, are they working? Can they be measured? Is there some way to put numbers to it? And otherwise, it's all abstract. So, for instance, heat action plans exist. They're supposed to protect health and incomes of people, but did they protect the home-based worker or the street vendor? We've seen many stories over the last few years, and we will look at that again. Uh, Agriculture, in rain-fed areas, millets are supposed to be an alternative that can protect incomes, but is that doing something for the farmers? We'll see. Similarly, drought relief, like Shai, you were mentioning, how does that work, and what are the gaps there are, and what data exists? So we'll look at each of these quickly. So hopefully this can feed our conversation after this. So this is a couple of years ago. We were looking at homeless people. In Delhi, one of the in every heat advisory that you see, one of the points that people say is stay indoors during the peak hours. But about 200,000 people in the national capital do not have that choice. They have to stay on scorched pavements. Shelters are inadequate. Then cold water is not accessible. Nights more increasingly are warmer. So basically, all the protections that your advisories give you and they're supposed to help you, they do not apply to a large section of population, and including vulnerable groups such as the elderly, such as uh, uh, children and the disabled. So all of them under the sun, scorched pavements through the summer, and that is affecting health, that is affecting incomes, and the interventions that are supposed to help them are not helping. Um, Similarly, for gig workers, and we've seen a lot of reporting around this as well. What happens when you're on the streets continuously? I mean, if you see the advisory for gig workers that the National Disaster Management Authority has, one of the things that you'll see is that they're supposed to be provided UV protective kits from the platforms. I don't think any of us have seen this on any gig worker that we've seen or met. And if you bring this up with people, um, like we did in this story a couple of months ago, people will laugh at you because this is not something they've heard. So these protections are supposed to technically help. These protections are supposed to protect, these measures are supposed to protect incomes, protect health, but that's not happening. So things are, stopping at the advisory level. They're not moving to the action, and where they are, they're inadequate. Um, Another thing is the advisory says don't mandate work in peak afternoon hours. Common sense. Yes, don't stay out, but that is also when all of us order lunch. So, uh, and the platforms need people on the streets, which is why they're incentivizing that time. And the incomes otherwise are so bad that if they do not work in those hours, what they don't make enough to sustain. So that's where the protections stop. And how do we kind of uh, put numbers to this? We can look at what was supposed to be spent. For instance, when you say that a shelter has to be built, we know how much money has to be spent by the municipal corporation. There may not be data for 100 cities, but you can start with your district, you can start with your city, and you can ask questions. Maybe the budget is not as clear, but you can ask these questions. They're accessible through RTIs. How much has been spent? What has been done? The physical progress is accessible. So, like I was saying, there is that triangulation of data sources that uh, comes into play here because there is no one standard source where we can look at that explains what's happening on the ground. So, uh, in agriculture stories, for instance, on adaptation, we look at if an irrigation project is supposed to help a rain-fed area, how much was spent? Did the water actually reach these areas? Did drought compensation reach people? Insurance, for instance, there's for fishers. Uh, Fishers insurance covers damage to vessels, accidents, and all of that, but it does not cover drop and catch, such as like a uh, crop insurance. So there are attempts. I think last year the government announced something, but what's happening with that, we still don't know. About some money has been allocated, but it's I think it is more for inland fishing than marine fisheries because they're looking at this area of operation, all of that. So I think marine fisheries insurance schemes exist, but they're not designed for the realities. Similarly, wetlands are supposed to increase the water retention, groundwater levels, but what is being done to protect these? Where are encroachments? So all of these are essentially when there is no direct way to look at the data, we're looking at aspects around the initiatives and seeing whether they're working or how they're working. Like I was saying, we test the claims to budget through sowing, through storage, through procurement data, like we'll see in the millet story in a second. And you identify the gap between the system as designed and the system as lived. For instance, like I was talking about the insurance story or the heat protection. So what it was supposed to do, how much is being spent, is the money being spent? You'll see that they will call for thousands of shelters, but the amount of money being allocated is so low that they try to convert some, already existing shelters, which is supposed to be, the way to do it. But also, it does not have all the facilities. You'll still see that in with the heat waves in hospitals are supposed to have, a heat wave room, but you will find doctors telling you that they take you into the medicine room which has an AC and things like that. So there is no specific place for heat wave protection in hospitals in many district hospitals. So what is being spent, how it is being spent, and physically, if you can verify the progress, I think that's where data can come into it. The second example that I will speak about is the millets story. So we started this looking at a couple of numbers. The first is that a Niti Aayog report in 2023 said there's a projection that there'll be a 40% drop in freshwater availability by 2030. And this is not India, this is globally. Secondly, we know that even if we don't know the number, 87% of groundwater is consumed by agriculture. Now, and the national water policy says that you have, to conserve water. How do you plan for this? Align cropping pattern with natural resource endowments, which is basically look at what's around you. If you have water, then you choose certain crops. If you don't, then you choose different crops. So millets are an answer to it, definitely. But are the conditions, is everything around it, is the policy around it robust enough that things are working out for farmers? We'll see. Um, So that's what the government did. It started off like many of us know, Odisha Millets Mission was the precursor. Then it went up to called 2018 the National Year of Millets. The momentum moved to the United Nations. It went to the budget speech where the finance minister spoke with pride. I'm quoting here by the service done by small farmers. And but the statistic that you'll see at the end, or the last numbers, I think, kind of tell you what the government is doing or not doing to promote millets. Procurement is still low. And these are things that we see with other crops as well. The procurement at MSP is limited, and we've spoken to people on the ground, and we'll show you an example. Market rates are low, so and they're sustained at that low level for a long time. The processing cost is high because the economies of scale don't come in at this level. The shelf life is low, so processing has to happen quickly. Transport adds up. Farm incomes remain low, and the demand, like I said, is inconsistent. What I mean, it's obvious that if we start having more millets, then probably the demand will increase. Millets account for about 5% of staple food. Despite all the promotion, it is still at 5%. And if we increase it to 20%, demand can rise, which means economies of scale can come in and procurement can increase at different levels for midday meals and various other schemes. But here's what's happening. Um, so Kajodmal Sharma of Jaipur's Pilia village, he has about 17 acres of farmland. Of that, he uses 6 acres to grow bajra. He produces about 35 quintal every year, and he's been making about 1,700 per quintal. The MSP, this was 2 years ago. MSP was 2,625, which is about 50% higher than what he's getting in the market. And procurement is not happening from the government at the level. I mean, even these 35 quintal are not being able to, be bought. So what was essentially supposed to then move this farmer away from water guzzling crops, and somebody who's taken the initiative, he's earning less than what he otherwise would have if systems existed. So the alternative that is suggested, when attempted, is not happening because it's not happening at scale. But what happens when it comes to your plate? Maida noodles are 70 grams. For 70 grams, they're 14 rupees. Wheat noodles are 28 rupees. Millet noodles are 38 rupees. Like I said, economies of scale, processing, all of these are coming into play. So the farmer is losing out. The consumer is paying more. And despite all promotion, this is happening. So one way to address availability of water and farm incomes is not working at the level that it is, because it is, it could be helpful because it is not, it does not have the scale yet. Maybe in a few years, if that comes up to 20%, it might happen. But currently, it is not protecting farmers' income. So how do you put numbers here? You look at procurement, you look at production over the years, and you will see that production has been increasing. And you'll see the the prices at the mandis and the prices in the market. So these are the numbers that you'll put around it, because there is no one way to see if it is otherwise effective. Um, on drought. So before I give it back to Shai for the questions on drought, this is notoriously difficult to see. Uh, and these are some points that I've brought in from the Manual for Drought Management from 2020. There is no universally accepted definition. We know that it is difficult to determine the beginning and the end. There's no indicator or index that can precisely forecast. Impacts are generally non-structural, difficult to quantify. Impact tends to get magnified in the event of successive drought. All of this is from the manual. This is not a finding. And if you step back, this is a nightmare for any data journalist, because there is no data. There is no way to measure. There is no way to predict. There is no way to ask questions based on what what is the definition and when it is declared. So these are some criteria that the government uses, monitors on a daily, weekly, or on a seasonal basis, fortnightly basis, to decide whether there is drought. That broadly 3 categories: meteorological, which is rainfall and dry spells; hydrological, which is how much water there is available and what is the stream flow; and agricultural, which is crop vigor, soil moisture, change in cropping patterns, sowing time. As we've seen, there's some delay in kharif sowing. 1 week ago, the sowing is about 20% less than last year. So now these are something that you can track, but these are also things that the government will use, local administrations will use to see whether somebody qualifies for drought relief, which means your neighbor might have less soil moisture and they might qualify for some drought relief, but your farm, for whatever reason, has slightly higher moisture content. And that may not it may not be enough to help your crop, but it is enough to disqualify you from relief. So the parameters that the government sets for drought, they're so complex that putting this together, I'm not sure anybody can on the ground tell you what is the factor that made them ineligible for relief. And this is one of the things that also comes through in loss and damage discussions, where how do you put numbers to even if there was money coming in from the countries for loss and damage, how do you put numbers? Who qualifies? So that's a problem. So how do we deal with this? This is a six-part series that we did in 2019. We looked at about 5 states, and we saw what's happening on the ground. Again, we started off with saying that 42% of land area was facing drought in the week ending March. We're currently in July, and so that was a much worse state that we were in. Versus states, there were 500 million people. So we began with the national pattern, and we tracked what was happening on the ground. So this is what's happening on the ground, and these are things that no data source, no continuous data will tell you, monitoring will tell you, and this is only happening on the streets. But you have to put this together with what little we know around the numbers. In that year, AP, there was distant migration from the Rayalaseema region to the coastal Andhra region to work on chili farms because the water was not available. In Gujarat, homes were abandoned. In areas like Kutch, cattle were abandoned. There was decline. We've seen that. The third set of pictures you'll see, this is a very common image. Shai will tell us that wherever there is water shortage, this is the typical image that comes up, but that has been the reality for a long time, despite other schemes. So, and in Karnataka again, parched farms, cattle are abandoned. So, what is this? How do you measure this, for instance? Which of these aspects can you measure to put data around this? So, number of migrants. States, districts do not count the number of migrants that are coming to them. And we've seen that during COVID. People were supposed to be given free grain, but the district administration did not know how many migrants were in their district. So as to access that kind of that kind of rations and food grain. So those numbers, if we look at those continuously, they also help in adaptation reporting. Similarly, cattle rearing, we can look at fodder availability, we can look at water availability, how that has changed over years. That is also an indicator as to how things are changing on the ground. On the water crisis, you look at Jal Jeevan, which is supposed to have help, but you see where water is flowing, where it is not flowing. So all of these, you're asking questions of what was supposed to have helped in these situations. You're looking at the schemes and you're trying to see what numbers are available, because there is no one sort of saying did drought relief help. There is, like I keep saying, you have to triangulate these sources to see whether something has helped. Declaration does not automatically mean support, like I was discussing, for reasons that the beneficiaries or non-beneficiaries do not even understand they might or might not qualify. Eligibility depends also on land holding. That is something that we discussed separately. There is, tenant farmers are not eligible. Who gets the money? Who use the money? That's a problem. Barmairs for farmers to migrate, like I showed you in AP. And insurance payouts under Fasal Bima Yojana are also not very clear. Again, the beneficiary criteria are much more complex than it would seem. So overall, there is no one measure where you can say that this is how you can look at data around adaptation, but you'll have to triangulate multiple sources. And with that, I'll give it back to you, Shai.
Thank you, Karthik, and thank you for using millets as and the Jal Jeevan mission to illustrate, because these are our showcase adaptation initiatives. We are trying to raise funds, and finally, it's the data of its implementation that's going to decide. And actually, you kind of touched upon the questions, but I want you to expand a little bit on what's the difference, like you shared, between using data to illustrate a story, yeah, and how do you find data for a story that you have already decided to tell? Yeah. What's that little thing? What's the trick there?
At the risk of cliche, this is something that been said about 100 years ago, which is that statistics are often used as a drunk uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. Um, so I think that is the problem with finding data for your story, that you already have a story in mind and you're looking to validate what you found. There's confirmation bias that steps in, and you will find data. I mean, there's so many data sets that whatever you find on the ground, there will be something, some data set in some particular perspective, you will find that data to support what you're saying. But uh, I would suggest being a data journalist and, with my experience, I would suggest the other option is how you go about it. You look at data. You look at data as one of your, you do literature review. You speak to multiple stakeholders before you go onto the ground. The data is one more such source. So you see what is happening, and then you know what questions to ask. So I think stories being sparked from data is a better way to reach add perspective than just looking for numbers, which is unfortunately what happens in a lot of stories. You add of 3 or 4 numbers, and it is supposed to be giving you a data perspective. It's not. It's you are trying to validate what you found. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I don't think that's complete in terms of reporting.
I mean, as an editor, you've been receiving, I know you receive a lot of pitches. And this is where my question as to where do our journalists go wrong when they reach for data for a climate story? Quick reflection on that, and we'll go back to Smriti, and then we'll come back for more conversation.
Um, I'll give you an example. On climate stories, in a bad rainfall year or in a year with erratic rainfall in high temperatures, you see there is farm distress. You go onto the ground and then you put numbers to it, and you say this is happening because of climate change. Now, for extreme weather events, at some point there are attribution studies but for slow moving, emergencies, there are no attribution studies. So the way we deal with that, for instance, is we look at data for the last 30, 40 years on rainfall, on temperature, and see what has changed. When you call it as climate, when you attribute a particularly bad year to climate change for a specific district, for instance, is that actually happening because the climate is changing in that district? Is that a trend that you're seeing, or is that a one-off? You ask these questions, you step back, you look at much more data, you see if there's an outlier. Sometimes you'll see that the total rainfall has not changed, but turns out that the number of dry days has increased, dry spells have become longer, and extreme rainfall events have increased, which means it is not helpful to your crop. It is, in fact, damaging. So I think you step back and you try to put that perspective instead of just trying to attack that one thing with the data, with any data, any numbers that you find.
Absolutely. Extremely helpful. Lot more questions coming to my mind now. But let's go to Smriti and then come back for our conversation. Karthik, thank you so much. Extremely useful, but so many more questions. Smriti, welcome back. Quickly, Smriti, I will come back to the question I had started asking you. Yeah. Where does adaptation actually sit, in this whole landscape of reporting climate change in our media? Yeah. And why do Indian newsrooms, at least now, are so slow on the uptake? Even if you Google adaptation, yeah, you will find very few stories that actually refer to adaptation. We find stories on disaster risk reduction, we find stories on mitigation. Where does adaptation sit in the newsroom?
Yeah. Um, Shai, I think you would appreciate what I'm saying, but allow me to go back a little bit in time from the present. Uh, Climate reporting in mainstream media began with a denial, and you know that as well as I do. Okay, that was about 30, 35 years ago. There's nothing like climate change. There was a lot of, and so the climate change beat or climate affected stories we had to fight to even get them into the newspapers and magazines that we worked for. If you covered climate, it's because you were interested in it, not the paper, not the publication you worked for. You were driven by some inner motivation to look at these issues. So we're coming from there now to a point in about 3 decades, to a point where, as an editor, I can see very clearly that most mainstream publications now have multiple climate related reporters. In a way, that's fantastic. That's an acknowledgement that climate change matters and we need to cover it a lot more. What has not changed, and this comes to your question, what has not changed is most media approach climate change in the event framework versus process framework. And I'll take an example, a non-climate example to say, to explain this. It's also partly related to climate. And so let's say event versus processes is something that we don't always pay attention to in newsrooms, but it is the most, according to me, one of the most fundamental frameworks from which at least editors should operate, if not reporters. What I mean is, let's say there is a bunch of malnutrition deaths that happen just outside of Bombay. 8 children, 8 infants die in a week. It's massive coverage, headlines all over the place, discussions, TV, blah, 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 blah. We know it all. But for those 8 infants to die in less than a week in one little village, 100 kilometers from Bombay, there were a number of processes that have been at work that led to that event, such as very young women getting married, back-to-back pregnancies, no healthcare facilities, no maternal care facilities, no PDS shops, no grain available, lots and lots of it. And then to add to that, you have unseasonal rains, so their subsistence crop goes away, all of that. What we cover in the media, what we are trained to cover or trained to look at is the events framework. And that events versus processes, that framework, I'm afraid, has continued to inform climate coverage even today. So we have, on the one hand, we have a lot more climate change coverage across newspapers, magazines, television, and smaller niche publications like the one I now edit, Question of Cities or Carbon Copy and so on. And yet, by and large, in 85-90% of what I see, we are still locked into the events framework. What that means for climate is when the temperature goes to 38 degrees, there is coverage of extreme heat. When a city floods massively after 4 hours of rain, and everything is disrupted, that's covered massively. What we are not, and same for air pollution, for example, what we are not looking at close enough and consistently enough are the processes behind each of these events. And I want to end this part with this, that climate change, climate coverage, even today, by and large, tends to be episodic. It's an episode-related, event-related coverage. The more we move away from that, I think the more wholesome that coverage will become. And then adaptation, we will be able to place adaptation not just as a story in itself, but across a spectrum. What would that spectrum look like? For example, immediate relief. Mumbai, Delhi hits 41 degrees. What are the immediate relief measures that governments have to put in? So there is that coverage, there is events coverage, there is immediate relief coverage. At the other end of the spectrum, I would think, lies the mitigation, right? That's really long term. What kind of buildings, how much concrete, how much open space, all of that, those are policy related mitigation measures. It climate tech comes into it, climate finance comes into it. Between that immediate relief and that long-term mitigation sits adaptation. And that occupies a fair amount of space, according to me, on that spectrum. But we are not paying enough attention to that entire space. We latch on to adaptation only when there is an event that is begging to be covered, not otherwise. And so, the more consistently we cover some of these things, I think not only will climate stories become richer, more detailed, more textured, and for me, more humane. Ultimately, it is about people that we're talking. And so, so that's broadly how I would place.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, this the need for consistent round the year reporting, because climate change is not only an extreme weather event. It is, and like Karthik showed, it's about agriculture, it's about water, it's about food, it's about health, and those effects are seen beyond that one single episode. Uh, you mentioned this earlier, and there are a lot of our students and our mentees who are very interested in reporting on cities, Smriti. We've seen proliferation of city climate action plan, Mumbai climate action plan, Calcutta action climate action plan. Everyone, from every action plan at the bottom of it, besides reducing emissions, is actually promising to become climate resilient. Yeah. But cities are deeply unequal places. You know that, I know that. When a city says it will adapt, whose adaptation are we actually talking about? Which communities? And Smriti, you've done so many, and you've edited so many, and you've looked at so many stories. Which communities, according to you, are most consistently left out of urban adaptation plans? The few that are already playing out. And is there difference between a city that's resilient and a city that's merely lucky? Yeah. So your thoughts. I mean, not all cities have had their worst event yet, but we're looking at them in the future. So your
Right,
thoughts on that?
right. I wish more cities were lucky. There aren't any lucky cities, unfortunately. Um, this thing about resilience is highly problematic. It's almost, and since all of you here are journalism students, you will appreciate what I'm going to say. Um, when we say murder happened, rape happened, it does not place the responsibility or the accountability on anyone. Instead, much better in journalism to say so and so has been accused of rape, so and so stands accused of murder. We're placing an accusation, perhaps, but there is a link to somebody who has done that act. Climate change is not happening as a divine thing, it's happening as a result of human decisions, city-wide decisions. Why do I say that? Is because, and in the last 4 years since I launched Question of Cities, Shai knows that we've looked at heat action plans and climate adaptation plans very, very closely in Question of Cities journal, but I've been looking at some of this even earlier. At this moment, 43 plus cities in India have heat action plans or climate action plans. I think heat action plans, many, many more cities have. Many cities have flood management plans, and so on and so forth. But I'll tell you where the problem. There are two clear problems that journalism needs to grapple with. And anyone who needs to do journalism work in this space needs to come to terms with. Number one is most of these plans, including the Mumbai Climate Action Plan, MCAP, which was among the first to be launched 4 years ago, none of these plans have a statutory um, authorization. They don't have a statutory position. What that means is that we can have the most fantastic climate adaptation plan or a heat action plan or a flood management plan, but there is no responsibility on any government, either local, state, or national, to bring it into operation. There is no authority that you and I can hold responsible for not acting on the provisions of that plan. Most of these plans are what I call wish documents. They are wish documents or wishful documents. We would like to reduce emissions by so and so, but how exactly are you going to do it? So MCAP, for instance, talks about having more green spaces in Mumbai. And many of you would be aware that Mumbai is really stressed for green spaces. We don't have enough of them at all. We are the lowest among the lowest of cities across India. So on the one hand, clear example here, the MCAP calls for not only maintaining existing green spaces, but increasing the acreage of green spaces, urban forests, native trees. So bring back some of the native trees, all of that, right? Fantastic. And we've all written about it. We've all done discussions on that. And then there is a development plan that the government of Maharashtra and the municipal corporation follows, which says lay a road in the sea that will go from south of Mumbai to the very north of Mumbai, and just for one stretch of that road, 46,000 mangrove trees will be cut. How do the two reconcile? As journalists, how do you even begin reconciling them? They don't reconcile. And so you as a journalist, you say, okay, can I now take this issue to the court? Can I go to the Bombay High Court and say, look, the government, the BMC now wants to slash 46,000 mangrove trees and an entire forest over 100 acres, 100 hectares. And this is going to open North Mumbai to more and more floods and sea water ingress. And then you realize that this slashing of mangroves has happened with the court's permission. So here you have the MCAP on one hand recommending more greenery, and the development plan for the city working at a complete tangent. Complete. I mean, it's working the other way. And so these plans have really very little meaning unless they are made statutory documents. So then some of us can go back to Bombay High Court and say, look, you can't allow the slashing of 46,000 mangroves because there is an MCAP. The plan says protect every tree, increase green coverage, increase mangroves, so on and so forth. Right now, we are not able to do that. And I think I will leave it to your imagination why the climate action plans, the heat action plans, do not have a statutory backing, and why they are probably not going to get the statutory backing anytime soon, simply because somebody then is going to be held accountable. And my point on resilience, therefore, flows from all of this, Shai. When we say cities are resilient, no city in the world is really completely resilient. It's always parts of cities that are slightly more climate adapted or climate adaptable than other parts of the city. We see this, I see this in my work across London, across New York, um, across most cities in America where the action plans became a thing, and across, say, Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, the cities that I look at closely in my journal. There is no citywide resilience, really speaking. Some parts are better adapted, and some parts are left to their fate, which is usually sink or swim, okay, or burn in a hellhole. I'll give you two quick examples here. Again, from Mumbai. In the last round of air pollution we had, the air AQI in a place called Kurla, which has a lot of industries, small manufacturing hubs, sits next to the Bandra Kurla complex near Dharavi, that some of you may have heard of. In Kurla, the AQI was in the very poor to hazardous range. It was 280 something for that day. On the same day, at the same time, the AQI in Worli, which is a sea-facing area, fairly upmarket area, parts of it are upmarket, the AQI was in double digits. It was below 100. So will you then call Mumbai on that day polluted city or a non-polluted good to live in city? Both are true. Similarly for rainfall, similarly for heat, there's been a difference of 4 to 5 degrees Celsius between areas in this very city. And so what I'm looking at, therefore, this city-wide climate resilience is beginning to make less and less sense to me as a journalist, as an editor. What I would really look for are two things. One, microclimates. What are the microclimates? How are microclimates behaving in different parts of the city? Right? So the microclimate in Kurla is very different from the microclimate in, say, Malabar Hill or Pedder Road or Worli, where the climate is much better because the sea is cleaning up the polluted air to a large extent. And so the microclimate there is much better. And so, therefore, once we focus on microclimates and area-based resilience, and I use the word resilience in quote marks, and I'll come to that very quickly and end with that. The more journalism focuses on microclimates within areas, within cities, within localities, we can push government action towards alleviating those conditions. And so the average, city-wise average, is really not making any sense. We have to move beyond that. Now, the term resilience is what I began with, the murder. Okay, resilience, it allows people who should have accountability to go scot-free. Whose resilience? What is resilience? Where is resilience? And so we need to unpack the term resilience, because climate resilience, and Shai, you would know this very well, this is something that came from the international climate circuit, from the COP discussions and, you know, the Bonn dialogues and lots of that. Now, we at our level, for us, we need to unpack the word resilience. And here's one way in which I do it, and which I think is fairly useful. Let's park the word resilience on the side for the moment and break it down. To me, there are two clear components. One is accountability, like I just finished speaking. Who is accountable to make air less polluted in Kurla? It's the same agency that is supposed to be responsible for Worli. What does this agency, what does this municipal corporation do? It tells the story of Worli and gets away not doing anything in Kurla. Okay? And therefore, the more we get into microclimate reportage and how that impacts people, the more we can push agencies towards being accountable at that level, at the micro level, at area level, right? And so one part of resilience is accountability, responsibility. Unless state agencies do their bit and people do their bit as well. Like, no, don't throw garbage into the Methi River. Don't go and fill up every lake that's there in Bangalore, right? And so that bit is important. But the next bit is important and it speaks to the question you asked me. The second element for me in resilience is about the burden. Who bears the burden of the climate events? Who bears the burden of climate change? And we know by now that the burden falls on the people who are least responsible for these events and who are least capable of absorbing the impacts. And so the moment we turn the question on its head from resilience to burden, we see a whole range of different stories. Who is actually bearing the burden of extreme heat? It's the outdoor workers. It's every worker who is there from Swiggy, Zomato, Amazon, every other delivery executive. It's every construction worker who's out there. It's every street vendor who is out there. And then the advisories fall completely flat because the advisories that we repeatedly get from governments is stay indoors. You can't stay indoors and run a city. And therefore, who is bearing the burden? How can a city reduce the burden on these people? And who is responsible for reducing the burden on these people? And then we come to resilience. Therefore, when we are looking at very few people who can bear the burden, bearing that burden, and agencies responsible for buffering most others, the majority, that is when we might come around to say that a city is resilient. I think I should stop there. I think I've taken a fairly circuitous route, but I hope this has been useful.
But you have thank you, Smruti. You have addressed a number of questions I had. Starting from the fact that, and something that Question of Cities has argued so well, that cities are not stratified. There are different levels. Yeah, and I think you've addressed that so well. I have questions about the craft now, but let me give you a little break, Smruti, and let me come to Karthik. Karthik, what and we have 15 minutes, so we will come to questions and answer, but I hope this is a question that is on everybody's mind as well. What public data sets, should every reporter know for covering climate linked stories like crop stress or farmer distress or agricultural census, the meteorological department, any others that you should, because agriculture is going to be the next big thing. Yeah, food security and water security is the next big. So, what are the public data sets you would point us to, Karthik, to improve our reporting, to improve our storytelling?
Uh, uh, Thanks, Shai. I think you've listed some of them. One is the IMD, India Meteorological Department. They have a weekly and a monthly bulletin as well as long-term data. The problem is they're trying to monetize this data, so you'll have to get, if you want to get specific data over the long term, like I was saying, for 30, 40 years, you'll have to speak to local administrations. You'll have to ask them for data. Otherwise, they want to monetize it. There is another thing that I closely follow on agriculture, which is Upaj, the unified portal for agricultural statistics. This has data on sowing. It has data for several years, but also the current situation. It has data on yield and production, and it has data on sowing and around agriculture. There is the agricultural census, like you said, but because it comes after so many years, there is some gap that some of these other data sets will try and fill. In addition to that, I would say you should look at the government's own year-end season end of the season reports, which is showing. I think there's a lot of data. For instance, around a cyclone, if you look at it, there is data on in the cyclone report that comes much later sometimes, but there is data on how many lives are lost, livelihoods lost, um, uh, property damage, crop damage in much detail. So it is not one data source, but I think it's a stack of sources that you look at for reporting.
And your advice on the fine print, because we tend to actually look at the headline numbers and not look at the disclaimers. We've seen stories that just run with the headline numbers and don't really look at. Any advice on that for young friends here?
Yeah, I think that is very important. If you have not worked with data before, don't start working with AI tools for parsing data. I would like you to sit with the data set uh, for some time before you give it to a tool. I mean, these are very powerful tools and you can do things in minutes that would otherwise take us weeks, which is, I'll be a fool to ask you not to do it. But when you begin, at least look at the data more closely. For instance, uh, I don't know how many of you know, but there are 5 district names in India that repeat. They're in multiple states, like Aurangabad. Unless you're looking at that list of 736 districts in India, you don't know that, the data that you're attributing to one district may be from a different state. So some of these things come only when you look at the data structure. Secondly, another example that I like to give is deaths in terms of, heat wave deaths, farmer suicides. The numbers are available, National Crime Records Bureau, it records data based on FIRs. There are other ways that, but you have to step back to how this is recorded, right? Which death is certified. For a farmer suicide, are they eligible for compensation? This is something that, you'll see that many of the administrations will say but they were, addicted to alcohol, or that they had other issues. This is not because of farm distress. So how that death is being certified, again, for heat wave related deaths, you'll see that a lot of deaths are, okay, death registration has improved. I must acknowledge death registration has improved. Medical certification of deaths has been improved. But a lot of deaths during heat waves are certified as cardiorespiratory or cardiovascular failure, which means what the heart is stopped and the lungs have stopped. But what led to it, they're trying to leave that out of it. So when you say, 700 people died during a season in so many states of heat, that is not the complete picture because the deaths are not being certified well. So how the data is being who's capturing the data, who's measuring, why they're measuring it, how they're measuring it, all of these affect the quality of the data that we have. One other example, and I'll stop.
Yeah.
There's a question in the National Family Health Survey. Huge survey, right? Hundreds of thousands of households are covered every 2 or 3 years. And there's a question on consumption of mass media. There was one glaring omission. The options are: do you listen to radio? Do you read a newspaper? Do you get your news from friends? Do you watch television? But the glaring omission that has changed in the last 5 years is: do you have a smartphone? Do you read? So the data that comes out of it is only as valuable as the question that is being asked and the option that is being given to the person recording the data.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Smruti, same question to you. I mean, if our students, I mean, I would actually break it into two after hearing Karthik's answer. What documents or public data sources that every urban climate reporter should look at, if there are any? And what is a realistic local starting point for a student who's going to file their first adaptation stories? Any thoughts? And then we'll open to questions. Yeah.
See, I think Karthik has answered most of the data bit, but I'll tell you from experience, what happens is that even government data doesn't always reconcile. Okay, for example, and Karthik, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but between 2000 and 2020, if you look at heat wave or heat related deaths in India, there are 3 different figures that depends, and it depends on who you look at. So the NCRB, the National Crime Records Bureau, tells us over 20 or 21, nearly 21,000, if I'm not mistaken, it was 20,600 deaths or something. For the same 20-year period, the IMD, which is also an Indian agency, weather agency, put the number of deaths at 10,500. That's a world of difference, you know. And so, and the National Disaster Management Authority, the NDMA, put it somewhere in between. I think it was around 16 or 17,000 for the same 20-year period. So what, as an editor, and this is not just for reporters, as an editor, what would I have to go with? These are all government agencies, and they're all accredited government agencies. It's not just a bunch of people sitting there and doing something, right? And so then I think editors and therefore reporters latch on to that figure that confirms their story bias. If your story is about how heat wave deaths went unreported, then you will latch on to the 20,700 figure and say, look, there were so many in a 20-year period, and we needed to, we should have looked at it better. But if you are slightly more charitable to the government, then you will latch on to the 10,500 figure and say, but in 20 years, we had only 10,500 deaths, not 20,700. And so I think, like, data and statistics and lies are all in one basket. And therefore, we can choose to take that which suits us in the narrative. And this is something I remember you asked at the beginning of this session, which data would you use, or do you first get the story and then fit the data in? And so there are these issues with the data. Having said that, and I think how do you resolve this? There is no one way to resolve when there is such a wide difference between three data sets for the same one metric of heat wave deaths by three government agencies. And you guys can go online and check this out. How do you resolve this? You don't really resolve it. So here's what we began doing when I was in the Hindustan Times I ran a series of climate-related coverage there, and which I bring over to Question of Cities now. We report on all three. We mention all three of them and say that this is what may have caused the variation or the difference, if we are able to do that. And for that, we do need to talk to data experts, data analysts, or people who are doing these metrics. And therefore, I would begin by saying journalists, even seasoned journalists and editors, let alone new reporters, should never begin from a place of certitude. Please always begin from a place of skepticism, from a place of questioning. So if you look for example, to take this example forward, if you as a reporter were pitching a story to me and you said that I wanted to place this in the larger framework of heat wave deaths, and you said heat wave deaths in India or heat related deaths in India, NCRB, because NCRB is a good metric to follow. What would you get? You would get that 20,600 figure, which is correct. You're absolutely accurate there, and accuracy is the building block of journalism. So you would be completely accurate. What you will not get is IMD for the same period of 20 years had half that number, or NDMA had about 3/4 that number. And therefore, my advice to people who pitch stories to me is always, don't begin looking from a small keyhole. Make your initial research canvas as wide as it can be. If you get lots of material that is contradictory, try solving those contradictions. Take it to your editor and say, there is this and there's this. How should I look at it? I think some part of this can get addressed when we broaden the scope and not look at specific specific points in our research. And this is becoming an increasing issue with me, and I would like to mention this in this room, is I've seen pitches coming to Question of Cities 4 years ago, and now we get a lot more of them because now a lot more people know about Question of Cities. But increasingly, I'm getting pitches that are extremely narrow. So when I widen that lens a little bit, some parts of that pitch falls flat. It just doesn't hold anymore. So I think we need to start from that. That's number one. Number two, and I'll very quickly come to this and wrap, is every climate story, if you're not doing only data journalism like, say, India Spend is doing, even they bring in people, impact, emotions, but every data is a person, is a family. And so climate stories work very well at the information level, data level. They work equally well, perhaps more powerfully, when you bring it down, when you distill these stories down to people. I want to give you one example and leave with this. We've spoken of heat, and I've kept most of my examples on heat because we've just come through a very, very bad, season. But a month back, when we were doing an edition on heat and heat-related, stories, one story that we went after in Bombay was how the built environment makes heat more unbearable, perhaps increases the heat level in certain parts, right? And so the if you have your mobile phones and if you're looking at them, then I want you all to open this story called The Built Form Worsens Unbearable Heat in Mumbai's SRA Buildings, the slum redevelopment buildings. It's a long story. It's a detailed story. Please take your time to go through it. What we did is, yes, we looked at heat wave, all of that, and then we brought that story down to one building, a few families, because these buildings have now become heat traps simply because of the way they were built. And nothing is changing. So, the materials used, the design, the built form, all of that is making these homes 4 to 5 to, in some cases, the story will detail it out for you, 6 degrees hotter than the outside in Bombay. That is incredible. And this is human disaster. This is not climate disaster. This is a human disaster, right? And so every data story, I would urge as an editor, pitch it to me with a human face.
Excellent. Karthik, Smriti, I could go on, but I have been told we've reached that 12:45 limit. And unfortunately, we really don't have any times for Q&A. But I'm sure many of them have been close to 64 online and nearly another 50, 60 in the room. I think 120 people young journalists have benefited from your insights. Thank you so much, Karthik. Smriti, for finding time, even as you read more and more pitches and more. I'm quite sure you're going to receive more from this bunch as well. And thank you to the audience as well, all of you, for joining in today. Karthik, Smriti, once again, we will keep looking at India Spend and looking at Question of Cities and look for more stories that inspire, inform, and give us insights. Thanks again. Sorry for cutting off. Sorry for no more questions. And once again, Smriti, Karthik, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Sai.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.